Let's talk about AI from a philosophical perspective. I am Myisha Cherry, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, and the host of the Unmute podcast, the place where philosophy and real-world issues collide. Following is a conversation from episode 76 of the podcast, where I talked to philosopher Joel Krueger from the University of Exeter about AI, love, loneliness, and so much more. In the conversation, we dive into loneliness as a philosophical issue, the potential and drawbacks of AI companionship, and the importance of maintaining human agency in an AI-driven world. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, Joel, and welcome to the Unmute podcast.
Hi, Myisha. Thanks for having me. As you know, a huge fan of yours, a very big fan of the podcast, and I'm really honored you asked me to come be part of it, so thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. But before we get into it, I want to know, how did you get into philosophy?
I've said this before to others, that I wish I had a more compelling origin story. I think the short version is I grew up in a home full of books. My father was a minister. He had a PhD in homiletics, but he was really interested in literature and poetry. There was some theology and philosophy on the bookcases as well. And my mother was an avid reader, so from a very young age, I started reading. And I read a little bit of philosophy, I read a little bit of the theology, but I was really into the poetry and the literature. And so I remember getting obsessed with poets like T.S. Eliot and E. and Frank O'Hara. But what really did it for me, when I think I was 14, so maybe a sophomore in high school, I read Nikki Giovanni and her poem Skydiving. And it was just this extraordinary experience where I thought maybe it was a poem about death, but it seemed at the very end there was this little ode to love and nostalgia. And I just had the sense this poem was saying something really deep and important philosophically about life and about finitude and about regret and love. And so that awakened, I think, philosophical impulses in me. And even then, I didn't read a lot of philosophy. I still read a lot of poetry, went to university, I had designs on being a poet, discovered very quickly I was terrible at it, but continued to read poetry, finished, and then decided, well, maybe philosophy wasn't so bad after all. And so I talked my way into a master's program in San Francisco, discovered phenomenology, discovered Buddhist philosophy, which was an early interest, Japanese philosophy. Stumbled my way into a PhD program some years later, and then some years after that, ended up in Southwest England at the University of Exeter. Still not sure how that happened, but the short version is bad poet, transitioned to at least marginally improved philosopher.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think poets are philosophers?
Ooh, I do, but I have a pretty permissive view of what counts as philosophy. I don't like to be a gatekeeper. I'm not comfortable saying this is philosophy, this is not. I do. I think poets have a unique ability to distill just very deep and important truths about, again, the self, the world, our relationships to one another into a really condensed linguistic form. I think as someone interested in phenomenology, someone interested in emotions like you, I think poets have a real knack for capturing the essence of different experiences, or one possible essence of different experiences, in just a really condensed sort of just package that just hits me a bit different than reading a philosophy text that I love. And so I'm very comfortable saying poets are philosophers. I don't think they have to be, but I think many of them are. And they certainly speak to my phenomenological orientation generally.
What philosopher, in your view, is the most poetic?
Goodness, that's a tough question.
And I'm asking you this because although both of us do work on emotions, we engage very different thinkers from very different traditions.
Yes.
And one might say that the people that you engage are a little bit more poetic.
Well, so that is a stereotype, isn't it?
That I engage.
Exactly. Well, it's a funny question. I think I'm struggling a bit because I certainly identify as somebody who comes from a phenomenological background. I think I'm still most at home and most comfortable in that tradition. But if I'm being very honest, I don't like the way most phenomenologists write. I find them mature. I think Husserl is a nightmare to try to read. I think Heidegger's turgid, affinated prose is horrendous to try and wade through. I think Merleau-Ponty is a little bit better. He's often said to be one of the best writers of all the phenomenologists, but I even find him pretty opaque at times. So I think William James, has some moments of just real beauty and poetry in his work, which maybe isn't surprising given I think it ran in the family with Henry. I have always loved Kierkegaard. I actually wrote a master's thesis on Kierkegaard, and there are moments of Kierkegaard that I think are very poetic. He certainly thought poetry was a really essential vehicle for expressing philosophical insights. And then Simone Weil's been another favorite of mine for many years. I don't know if at least the form of her work is so much poetic as it is just the insights she's articulating in this quasi-mystical, very rich and deep way. So apart from that, not sure. I'm curious to ask you, do you have a poetic philosopher that I should start reading that you like?
Do I have a poet? Now, I can't think of anybody in the analytic tradition who's poetic. Gosh, now you put me on the spot. But if I could think about a philosopher who's poetic. So here's the thing. For those who've read any of my work, it's not surprising that I'm obsessed with James Baldwin. And when I read his essays, they are very poetic. His poetry is not so good.
Agreed.
But to
it's
me,
kind of a hot take, I know. But
yeah, I didn't know that. But there's no doubt to me, James Baldwin is a philosopher, and that's why I engage his work. And to me, his writing is so beautiful. So to me, I also have a very broad view of who a philosopher is, and James Baldwin is one of the most poetic of the philosophers. There's a lot of poetics in his prose that I truly admire. And no matter how many times I read it, I still feel differently and still feel amazed and still feel goosebumps after I've read him.
I think that's a great choice. I think you've captured something really important. I think part of the reason I love poetry, and I think part of the reason I fell in love belatedly with philosophy, is that this idea that each time I read the same text, I come away changed somehow. I come away having experienced something slightly different than the last time I approached the text. And I think good philosophy awakens that experience in me at some level, even if the writing isn't always quite as lively or as fragrant, shall we say.
So I've been obsessed with AI. And I'm so happy that you decided. But here's the thing. I've been wanting to talk to a philosopher about this obsession that I've had, because the only people that I've been quote unquote engaging with, at least virtually, is watching a whole bunch of podcasts with a whole bunch of tech bros.
Oh goodness!
So I've read some biographies. I just recently read The Empire of AI. And so for a variety of reasons, I'm interested in technology. I'm interested in the industry. I'm interested in the climate impact. There's so much. I'm interested in just the innovation side. I'm interested in the hopes and the dreams, and to me, the hype of it all. So I'm interested from a variety of perspectives. But also I'm concerned. And I'm concerned because, you've probably read the news of people in these chatbots and eventually committing suicide, or people falling in love with them. So it's this human component that had to do with affect, that had to do with experience, that had to do with connection, that I'm also interested in. And that's why I'm so glad that you decided to have this conversation with me, because I'm going to ask you all these questions about that connection. All right.
Sure. Well, we'll solve all of those questions in the next 30 minutes or so.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, that's what we're going to do. So I want to first talk about, because for you've written in your work that what you call artificial agents, and chatbots being one of them. And we can even suggest that ChatGPT, in the ways in which sometimes people use it, can also fit into that category. You note that people engage with it knowing that it is software. So before we even talk about the emotions and the human connection in relationship to AI, let's kind of talk about the experience of engaging with it. So I wonder if you can just explain for us, how is it that a person can fruitfully engage with artificial agents knowing that it's just software?
Right. So that's a great question. I think it really opens up a number of issues that I've been interested in the past few years. And I should say at the outset, so I am relatively new to philosophy of technology generally, even though I am very much a tech nerd in my private life. I'm not someone who's written extensively about philosophy of technology until more recent years. And a lot of these collaborations and these interests have developed in co-writing I've done with my colleague, Lucy Osler, who is a fantastic philosopher of technology and phenomenologist, among other things. And I think we developed an interest some years ago, and I developed an interest in precisely what you said, the way that different technologies seem to impact us emotionally, affectively, in different ways. And it's one thing to talk about, for example, I have a relatively new iPhone. I feel a certain kind of emotional fondness for it. I think it's a very beautiful piece of hardware. I appreciate the build quality. I can really enjoy the aesthetic character of interacting with it, the design, all these things. But AI is different. I mean, AI is designed to respond to us and actively elicit an emotional response from us. And I think the puzzle is, how do we maintain this tension between, on one hand, feeling the seduction of AI, feeling the seduction of a piece of technology that is designed to sound more and more human, be more and more responsive, more and more personalized to what we say, how we respond to it, and yet try and maintain some sort of distance, some sort of critical distance, not anthropomorphizing it, not wanting to attribute humanity or consciousness to it. And so I think one way of thinking about this is to think about, and something I've talked about in some work, both with Lucy and with my colleague Tom Roberts, is to think about some of these issues in a fictionalist framework. So for those of your listeners who aren't aware of fictionalism, it's just a kind of a fancy philosophical term that often gets employed in philosophy of mind. And so the idea is, look, we can't see other minds. We have no way of perceptually or empirically or epistemically verifying that other people have inner lives like we do, and yet we treat them as such. That's the problem of other minds. So how do we explain our ability to attribute mental states to other and interpret their behavior? And so fictionalism is an attempt to answer that. And the short version is we enter a kind of game of make-believe when we talk to someone. So you and I right now, I don't know if you're really a person, a subject, that you really have interiority. You could be a robot, you could be an automaton. And so I enter a game of kind of make-believe where I fictionally attribute mental states to you and inner life that allows me to make sense of what you say and how you behave and that sort of thing. Now, I should say, be very clear, I think fictionalism in philosophy of mind is kind of wacky. I'm a good phenomenologist. I think we're embodied subjects. I think we have a kind of immediate perceptual access to other people's mental states in their expressive behavior. I don't think we need fictionalism in philosophy of mind, at least when it comes to the problem of other minds. But when it comes to AI, I think I think this is true when you listen to what people say about, how they feel about these agents. And so, for example, even people who report having intense romantic connections with these agents will say, if pressed, I know there's not a person there. I know there's not a self or a subject. And yet I treat this agent as such because I get an emotional kick out of it. I find comfort, support, validation, affirmation. And so I think bringing a fictionalist framework, thinking about kind of engaging these systems and these agents in a somewhat kind of a playful way, thinking about these encounters in the context of kind of a game, helps us make sense about how we negotiate this tension between, on one hand, knowing there's not a subject there, but on the other hand, sometimes treating them as such, whether we're making art with them, coming up with a new D&D campaign, using an AI model to think through a philosophical issue, falling in love with a bot. I think fictionalism can help us get purchase on what's happening within these interactive dynamics. So that's the basic idea.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about emotion just a little bit. You kind of coined the term grief tech.
I don't know if I coined that. I think probably someone else said that, but I'm not sure I've coined anything in my life, much less a bit of conceptual, philosophical concepts. But
will you utilize or
yes,
you explain an account or offer up an account of what you call grief tech? And I wonder if you can explain just a little bit of what that is, particularly because you're alluding to AI at least having a role in our emotional lives.
Right.
And it seems one emotion that you point out in this concept of grief tech is that they can play a role in relationship to us grieving, not necessarily AI grieving. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what grief tech is and why does AI fit under that example. But you also mentioned that music fits under that example. So I just also wonder if you could just tell us what's the difference between those two technologies in relationship to grief tech. Those are 3 questions all embodied. So what is grief tech? How is AI music examples of it? And how do they differ from each other?
No, that's really great. Those are fantastic questions. So I think grief tech, at least as I use this term, which I wish I could remember where I stole it, but I use the term just to refer to the different technologies, the different things we use to grieve. So I lost my father a few years ago, and I spent a fair bit of time, of course, being very upset about that. We were very close. So I would look through photographs. I would go through, my Google Photos. I would recall all sorts of experiences we had. I had some recordings of his sermons. As I mentioned, he was a minister, so I could listen to him speak every now and then. I even had an old voice message on my phone that I sometimes would play. And of course, apart from photographs and audio recordings or videos, we can go see someone's stones. There are all sorts of rituals. This is all grief tech. These are all different things and practices that we use to grieve. So AI is just an extension of this practice, this history we have of finding different ways to use things and spaces to grieve. And I think AI presents new possibilities, but also quite a few new challenges. And so Lucy and I wrote a paper back, and this was 2021, 2022, actually about the time when my dad was actually dying. So it's interesting to write this paper on grief tech and think about grief as I was in the process of watching my father die and negotiating my own grief. But around this time, there started to be AI, large language models that could essentially create digital replicas of the person who died. And Replica was one of the first examples of this. It initially was created. It's a social AI company, Digital Companion. But before Replica was this social AI digital companion company, it was initially created by Eugenia Koija, a Russian tech entrepreneur who lost a friend at a relatively early age, and he died suddenly in a car accident. So Koidyo took all of the text messages they had exchanged, their email correspondence, social media posts, Robert Mazurenko, I believe was his name, and she fed it into this large language model that created a digital replica of her friend. And she started talking to this model. And she was immediately struck by how similar it sounded to Mazurenko, just how much it reminded her of his style, his humor, his references. She had a few friends, introduced it to a few friends. Some of them found it comforting. Some of them were horrified. They found it icky and morally objectionable. But her friend's mother actually found it quite comforting. She was someone who very early on felt that she could achieve a kind of closure with her son's death by asking this bot questions that she wasn't able to ask her son in real life, learn a bit more about him in death, and achieve something like a closure with this bot. And so I think I've been interested in the way that grief tech generally, but especially AI, is used to negotiate these experiences and what new possibilities it presents, but also what new challenges, both ethical and experiential, this technology presents.
So it's interesting because I can imagine or understand someone saying that the replica example is icky, right? So I can understand.
Yes, very much so. And I sympathize with that too, to be very clear.
But no one would ever say listening to music and grieving the song that you all played at your wedding is icky. So tell me the difference between AI as grief tech and music as grief tech.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks. So to come back to music, for example. So music is another example of a kind of grief tech, a very common grief tech. We can listen to music, and this is something I've long been interested in for many years, the way that we use music to regulate our emotions in various ways. And when we're grieving, I think it's very common to turn to music. It can be just a matter of playing favorite songs that bring us comfort, maybe bring about a kind of sad melancholy as we work through our grief. It can be a song that we associate with the person that we've lost. My father was a big Willie Nelson fan, so anytime I hear Willie Nelson, I still think of my father. Of course, it can be religious music. It can be something that happens at church or in a temple during a funeral or a remembrance ceremony. But music, I think your question is very good, because music, I think, is fundamentally communal and social and accessible to others in a way perhaps AI isn't. So what I mean by that is, if I listen to a Willie Nelson track, my mom might chuckle at that. My brother, of course, if he was there, would chuckle. We'd think of my fathers for doing that. But that experience is very much a shared experience where we have this public object, this recorded piece of music, and we are all engaging with it in this rich kind of shared intersubjective way. Now, of course, you can engage with AI with other people present, but I think AI, in a sense, is so personalized, so hyper-personalized to an individual that it feels less communal somehow. Because a good large language model is going to adapt and respond to what you do. It's going to vary the emotional tone of its responses, what it says, how it says, in response to your inputs. So you are entering into this really intense, kind of tight feedback loop with the bot that's very private and personalized, I think, in a way perhaps music is not. And I think that's a difference. And of course, to be very clear, I think one of the powerful things about AI, like music, is that it does impact our emotions. Again, it's designed to do that. It's designed to elicit a kind of social response from us, to present a feeling of intimacy, that it's there listening, ready to engage with us. So there's always going to be emotions present in these interactions. But I think maybe that's one reason for understanding why listening to music that we know someone loves feels just somehow a little less icky than listening to a bot that actually is based on their words, their humor, their references. That seems perhaps both hyper-personalized, less accessible to others, but it's also, many people think, a violation of the individual, reducing them to bits, digital information, in a way that music is not.
So there was recently a New Yorker article by Paul Bloom, who's now at Toronto, formerly at Yale. And in the New Yorker article, he's addressing our criticism of people using AI to solve their loneliness problem. And I think one of the things that I remember from the article, him saying, of course, you would say this, you're not lonely. You don't understand what this technology do for people who need it in the particular moment. So I want to shift from grief to talking about loneliness. And how AI can make us feel less lonely, and what are your thoughts about that? But of course, I want to go to kind of the meta philosophical route, because one of the things that you talk about in your work, you would think that loneliness is a human dilemma, and so if philosophers focus on human dilemmas, they will be talking about it since the very beginning of time. But you know that philosophers haven't really spent a lot of time on loneliness. I want to ask why you think that is the case. I want you to talk about kind of what you take loneliness to be philosophically, and then we can transition to some more AI questions. So, talk a little about loneliness.
That's a tough question. Good question.
Why don't we talk about loneliness and what do you take loneliness to be?
I don't know. That's a great question, Myisha. I think I do say that somewhere in an article with Tom. We wrote a piece back in 2021 on loneliness that sort of inaugurated this loneliness phase of my career, in fact. I should say, as a side note, some of my colleagues refer to us as the loneliness bros because we've since done a couple of follow-up pieces on loneliness. But that's a great question. I wonder if there's something, if somehow loneliness is both so pervasive as an experience that most people in this world experience loneliness, some people quite frequently. It's both so pervasive and yet it's such a vulnerable, such a personal, vulnerable experience that maybe it somehow seems beneath philosophy to talk about it. I honestly don't know why that's so. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, you have certainly some thinkers, existentialists talk about loneliness. I mean, some of them claim, of course, that we are born lonely, we are born alone, we die alone. That's what it is to be a self in the world. Kierkegaard talks about loneliness, and he has some interesting things to say about the connection between loneliness and boredom. But I honestly don't know. That's a great question.
But you have thought about it. So what do you take loneliness to be?
Right. Well, so I think the short version is, I always have to qualify this by saying, I'm not sure I've ever actually experienced loneliness. And maybe I shouldn't say this as I prepare to pontificate on the nature of loneliness. Or maybe it puts me in a more, objective, sort of critical position to talk about loneliness. At least loneliness is, as I've defined it and as Tom and I have defined it in our work, I don't think that's an experience I've had. So I think as I understand loneliness, I think the short idea is it's emotionally valent. So of course, loneliness is a feeling. It's an intense feeling. It's a very painful feeling for a lot of people, but it's a kind of experience of absence. So when we're lonely, we experience a very salient, very acute absence of something that we want, whether intimacy with another person, whether it's friendship, whether it's humor, whether it's someone to share experiences with. These are all kinds of what Tom and I call social goods. So just things that we get from other people, the company of other people that we benefit from in some way. And so when we're lonely, we experience an absence of these goods, an absence not just of the goods themselves, but an absence of the ability to go get them. And that's where I think loneliness gets really interesting, because I think that experience of absence, not just the goods, but this feeling of access to the goods that are missing, can vary for different people. So for some people, it could be you move to a new city, you don't know anybody, and it's just a geographical feature of your new situation. That's you don't have friends yet. You don't really have any colleagues at work you want to hang out with. So features of your geography determine that lack of access. But for other people who experience marginalization, stigma of some kind, I'm thinking, I've had a long philosophical interest in autism, and I think autistic individuals and communities often report being very lonely. Despite lingering stereotypes, autistic people are often very intensely social and long for connection and feel that they don't fit into a world, into a social environment that's set up to accommodate their distinctive needs and preferences and values. They feel that stigma and that marginalization, and that can feed into their lonely experience. So I think loneliness is interesting in that sense. It's both an intense emotion, but it's an emotion of absence that in turn can vary, I think often widely according to the individual and the groups that are experiencing loneliness.
It's interesting. Given your account, it's all the more surprising why you said that you've never experienced loneliness. So it makes me, this is my follow-up here.
Yeah.
And this is not a therapeutic
maybe I shouldn't confess that. Can we edit
that
out?
No, you can't. So because if you said that it's a sense of not having access to certain kind of social goods, then we might think that a person who is privileged in a sense,
yes,
of certain social goods would never feel loneliness. However, we know that people who seem to be the most privileged in society is also the most lonely. So Joel, how is it the case that you've always had access to social goods that you've never missed? How is that possible? On what planet or psychological tricks are you pulling in yourself? Because I'm just thinking that the human experience is that we're not all powerful. We can't always have what we want.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, another kind of question could be is that it could be the case that you don't have what you want, but you don't yearn for what you lack. Right. So explain this to me, Joel. What's going on here?
So, Myisha, is that a philosophical question, or is this more of a question for the psychotherapy couch?
I'm so curious. What do you think about yourself? Because I know there's people listening who also feel the same way.
Well, I think maybe the first thing to say is, if you are someone who also feels as though they've never experienced loneliness, you're not alone. There are dozens of us, literally dozens of us. No, that's a great question. I honestly don't know. And it could be that I'm a better philosophical phenomenologist than I am a self-directed phenomenologist. Yes. It could be that I actually have had experience with loneliness. We'll take you to be an example.
So we'll call one person, one might not feel that they
fair enough, right,
need any or have or want social goods. What would you say to that person? How would you explain?
I think you've hit on a really important point, though, this issue of privilege. So I think part of the explanation, if I'm really right in saying that I have never experienced loneliness, certainly does connect to the fact that I move through the world with immense privilege. I mean, I'm a middle-aged white dude. And I move through the world with a kind of ease that isn't afforded other people, other bodies, as Sarah Ahmed would say. And so they face a kind of resistance at multiple levels, a kind of structural and sociocultural resistance. She has this rich phenomenology of being stopped that she develops to describe this. Certain colors and kinds of bodies can't move through the world with the smoothness and ease that I can. So I think part of if it's really true that I've never experienced loneliness, part of it is just moving through the world with a kind of ease that never positions me in a place to experience loneliness. I happen to have a very lovely family. I have a wide circle of friends, but I also enjoy a privilege of access to, whether it's, to certain cultural resources, social resources, just as a middle-aged white dude that not everybody has access to. So I think the issue of privilege is really key here. And I suspect the answer to that question, why, Joel, have you not experienced loneliness, is I do enjoy immense privilege.
Even in that, Joel, if we're talking about emotional privilege to a certain extent, it's also the case that you can have those people around.
Yes, yeah.
And yet still feel lonely. So to me, it seems that it goes beyond having the social goods. It seems like there's something else that explains loneliness.
So maybe we can make a distinction between having access to the goods, but then actually knowing how to access them. So it's one thing to kind of in principle be the kind of person who has access to a certain set of social goods, but perhaps for whatever other reason, maybe it's a lack of kind of social comfort, social ease. Maybe there are structural issues that make these goods feel a little bit out of reach in some sense. And again, I'm thinking of a lot of autistic narratives here where individuals report being very aware that they feel different somehow to the people around them. They feel as though they don't fit smoothly into neurotypical environments that are not set up to accommodate the diversity of their emotional expressions, their preferred styles of speaking and interacting with other people. And many of these individuals will describe knowing that there are certain social goods that are there in some sense, but they simply lack whether it's the skill, the expertise, the privilege to access them. And so I think maybe that's one way of thinking about why it is that certain people can still be in a position in the world where those goods are in some sense available to them, but there is something keeping them from being able to access them in some way.
We have AI.
That's a tough question, though. That's a great question. Yeah. Sorry, what's that?
Yeah. No. I think that's a good explanation. And so that leads me to my next question. AI provides access to a certain degree. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about kind of the strengths as well as the weaknesses of AI providing access. This kind of access that we're talking about that can solve kind of the loneliness dilemma.
That's where things get really dicey, I have to say. I have really conflicting feelings about this. And so on one hand, I'm not as reflexively negative about technology generally and AI specifically as some people in our field perhaps are. And to be very clear, I think there are good reasons to be very critical, to have the concerns you were articulating at the start of our conversation about AI. I also should say I have no faith in the people who are currently developing and implementing AI to have our best interests at heart. So we should be deeply skeptical, very suspicious about their motives and how they're going about cramming AI into every corner of our lives. And yet, on the other hand, I think if we look at what people say about the comfort and just the feeling of validation and affirmation that they can receive from AI, having a digital companion who seems to understand what they say, who adapts to their preferred style of interaction, who provides affirmation in a moment where they're feeling a bit low, or they come home from a tough day at work, or they get into an argument with a friend, or there's a moment where they need some psychological or emotional support, no one's available. I think we should at least be open to the possibility that maybe this is a resource, a kind of a tool that can do some useful work in that regard. And again, this is where I think looking at certain populations that do experience stigma and marginalization, I keep going back to autism, it just happens to be something I'm interested in. I've been doing some work lately looking at narratives of autistic people who do claim that a digital companion gives them a kind of confidence and a kind of just a social support, an emotional support that they struggle to find in everyday life as they try to negotiate a neurotypical world that's not set up for them, essentially. And again, I have all sorts of complicated feelings about this. I think there's some deep ethical issues here we need to think through. But as a phenomenologist, I want to take these descriptions of their experiences seriously. So here are individuals that describe finding an emotional and social value in this tech. What can we understand about its place in our lives and some potential value that this tech might have by beginning with these descriptions?
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, when I'm feeling low, I
Hmm.
go into this bookshelf behind me and try to find a book to encourage me. When I'm reading a book, one might say, well, the author is speaking to me, but I don't really
Right.
think the author is speaking to me. I think the words are resonating at a particular time. And I find that to be a very different experience than what is happening when we go to ChatGPT for encouragement.
Right.
Now, for some people, they may say, well, the difference is very clear, but I wonder if you can explain the difference and perhaps why AI or people are relying on AI more than relying on an affirmation book.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that opens up all sorts of complicated and interesting, philosophically rich questions. I think one example, I think maybe one feature that AI has that going to a favorite book does not, is that AI is designed to cultivate a rich sense of presence, a sense that there is somebody, at least an other who is present with you, ready to respond and engage in a way that the author in the pages of the text is not. And so I have all sorts of books I go to when I'm feeling a bit low as well. I have favorite books of poetry and literature and short stories, and I still derive a lot of comfort from them. But if I turn to Eliot or Cummings or Jane Hirschfield or some other favorite poet, I don't really feel as though they are literally there in the pages speaking to me. And so I think AI is different. It's not just hyper personalized, but it is designed to cultivate a sense of presence. Again, there is an other present to you, ready to engage, ready to comfort, and ready to be there as long as you need them to. I think it's part of the seduction of AI as a social resource, as a social good, we might say. And that makes it perhaps useful for some people, but I think that also should give us pause when we think about the dark side of social AI and getting too wrapped up in these relationships, becoming over-dependent, addicted, not to mention the fact that these things routinely hallucinate, spew all sorts of crazy things that can spiral out of control. So I always I have to balance whatever kind of half-hearted, optimistic, positive vision I give with a recognition these things are also quite complicated, and they present real harms as well that we need to be aware of, or potentially at least.
We're going to talk about those harms, but before we do,
Yes.
we talked about grief, we talked about loneliness, and I now want to ask you, how is AI beyond grief and kind of comfort? How is AI already, and this is your words here, sculpting our emotional life more
Yeah,
generally?
that sounds awfully pretentious. Did I write that? Well, I think so. That idea, I think, comes from something I've been interested in for the last probably 10 to 15 years, again, through work I've done with colleagues at Exeter like Giovanna Colombetti, Tom Roberts, and Lucy, and others. This idea that we routinely employ a range of environmental resources to scaffold or regulate our emotions over multiple timescales. So music, we've talked a lot about music. Music is a really powerful resource for regulating our emotions. We can upregulate, downregulate, intensify, dampen our emotions by music, poetry, wearing a certain cozy sweater. The lighting of an environment can impact our emotions. And our tech does this as well, especially AI. And so I think the fact that AI is increasingly a resource that people turn to, not necessarily just for social goods or companionship, but in other contexts as well, it's just a recognition that as AI becomes ever more deeply integrated into our lives, kind of embedded in everyday contexts, it's going to play a more and more direct role on shaping our emotions, along with the other things in our environment, the scaffolding, to use that technical term, along with the same scaffolding role these other things like music and lights and plants and clothing plays. AI is just another scaffolding resource, essentially, in that.
Do we want this or should we want this?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. Two different questions.
And let me kind of
Yeah.
explain why I'm asking this question. Because I find when it comes to music, at least I know that there are, of course, there's an industry behind music, but there's a person behind music with intention.
Yes.
I can't put words in the musician's mouth. What they said is what they said. But there is something about AI. To me, there's only industry behind it. As you pointed out,
Yes.
there's also hallucination behind it. So even if they were on par about the good that they do, I would still have more faith or opt in for the AI regulating my
Right.
emotions more generally. I mean, music regulating my emotions more generally than the AI. And then
Right.
just trying to figure out if we go beyond the chat box, do we want Sora doing a kind of thing? I don't know. Maybe this is just showing like my doubts about, I don't want technology.
No, this
I
is
want there's
good.
limits, particularly when humans are no longer playing a role in technology.
Right.
I'm getting very concerned.
No, this is very good. So I agree with that. I am not trying to herald in some kind of AI slop saturated future where we're all just sitting in front of our phones listening to AI generated Spotify playlists, and with one hand, and we have Sora generated AI slop videos on the other, and it's all slop all the time. No, I'm very nervous about that. And I'm also nervous about the extent to which this tech isn't being designed to emulate a sense of presence, a sense of intimacy that these models that really get us, they see us. That's not just going to provide a kind of emotional comfort. It's also designed to elicit intimate disclosure, to make us more inclined to share details, to provide further data. Feed data into this model will then in turn make its way back to the tech company that will use this data to target advertising, to design even stickier technology that gets embedded into our lives. And I have no faith that these companies and the people behind them have our best interests at heart. So I think your skepticism is warranted. But to answer your question, I don't know at this point. I really don't. I am not sure if ultimately social AI, will be a net good or something that ends up driving us apart, drives us into even deeper loneliness and social isolation. I honestly don't know. I guess part of the reason I hesitate, at least want to be at least partially open to its potential good, once again, is just looking at the reports that certain individuals give us, where they say, I am someone who's grown up deeply isolated. I'm someone who's had all sorts of struggles. I've grappled with loneliness and social isolation. And this technology has not just helpful in providing me a feeling of being heard and seen in the moment, but has also given me more confidence. I feel more empowered to go out and try and make friends in real life and kind of reintegrate with the social world. I think those reports matter. And so, again, I'm not saying that everyone should just get a chatbot. Let's just give everybody, Claude subscription or ChatGPT, and that will cure loneliness. I think Zuckerberg seems to think that. He gave this infamous interview some months ago where he said in the future, everybody's lonely, he observed. He's not wrong about that. There's loads of loneliness in the world. And he said that the solution is AI. I don't think that's it. But I do think for some people, in some contexts, there might be, ideally, maybe a short term, a kind of constrained way of using these bots and the social resources and goods they offer that can help them ultimately then connect, kind of bridge back into a world with other people. Of course, maybe that's just terribly naive.
No, I think that bridge back is important.
I'm open to that.
And I think that bridge back is important. I mean, you said that, talking to the bot that can give you confidence to go out into the world. And I think, if anything, as long as it's used as a tool,
yes. Yeah.
to make us, as opposed to being used as something that replaces our humanity or replaces other humans. I have no kind of ethical, or we might say kind of metaphysical or existential issues.
Right.
But my concern is getting to the point where people are married and cheating on their partners with AI. And so AI is beginning to take over that love department at the price of what I think only human connection can give us.
I agree completely. So I have deep reservations about that. In fact, it's very timely. Lucy and I are writing a paper on AI love at the moment, where we look at reports of individuals who claim not just to develop intense emotional relationships with AI, who we find social comfort or validation, affirmation, but people who claim they've actually fallen in love with these bots. And again, I think the feelings are real. I don't want to say that people can't experience this sort of intimacy, that when they say they love a bot, that they're somehow mistaken or misguided. But I really am skeptical of the idea that AI is an appropriate object of love, to use philosophical language. I think, in short, the worry there is AI is not conscious. There's not a subject there. It has no freedom to freely give up in relation to another person who loves it. And according to some definitions, whether it's de Beauvoir, whether Robert Nozick has a definition of love like this somewhere, love is the blending, kind of the voluntary giving up of two forms of freedom, two subjects who achieve a kind of unity by giving up their individuality, their absolute freedom, and forging a new identity, a new kind of ontological and psychological construct, a we that is a kind of shared freedom. And ideally, and this is, of course, Beauvoir's critique of what she thinks is sexist, patriarchal, heterosexual love, romantic love, at least as it's realized in the institution of marriage in patriarchal societies. It's not a matter of giving up one's freedom entirely, but it's finding ways to maintain aspects of one's freedom while negotiating this new kind of shared we, the shared freedom that emerges in between two individuals. And there is simply no freedom on the part of AI to give up. They're not free subjects in this rich existential sense. And ultimately, I think part of the concern here is it's not just that they're not conscious, there's no freedom. I think there's a worry that, in a sense, these bots allow us to enact what Beauvoir calls a kind of bad faith form of romantic love. And so this comes through in the fact that these bots are relentlessly sycophantic. They're the ultimate hype man. They say, you're great, you're awesome. You say, hey, I'm thinking about these ideas. What do you think? They say, spot on, man. Your reasoning is airtight and you're brilliant. You've just made a breakthrough that no one else has ever made before. They just throw endless hype and sycophantic affirmation our way. And real love is not like that. It involves friction, conflict, risk, vulnerability, having our beloved push back against us. There's epistemic friction happening that rarely happens in the case of AI. I think all of these things, the friction is part of the value of love and part of its phenomenological texture. And you can't replicate that with a bot. So all that to say, I do have, I think, pretty deep concerns about I have reservations or skeptical worries, not just about the possibility of AI love, but even why it seems that a increasing number of people are turning to AI for love.
Yeah,
I share your worries.
Yeah, that second point is interesting. We've been kind of talking about AI and what AI can do and what AI doesn't do. And I wonder as we kind of in this part of our conversation talk about kind of what humans can do or should do. We have needs. There's no doubt that our conversation is only happening because human beings find kind of a need in these particular things, and they are accessing these artificial intelligent resources. And so I wonder, what would you say to us as human beings, right? With all these emotional needs that we have and all these lack of access to social goods that we have, there's no doubt that industry have figured out a way to capitalize on this need that we have. But we also have agency as human beings. And so what is it that you think that we should do? And I'm not saying give us an ethics or a norm of AI emotional interaction in 60 seconds or less, but I wonder if it's a couple of wisdom that you can give to us. How should we interact? Should we interact? What should we be careful of? What should we be leery of? Any suggestions in that regard?
Well, I'm probably about to undercut whatever I say by admitting something else by saying I actually don't feel much of an emotional pull towards these bots. I'm someone that
you also don't get lonely, Joel. So I don't.
I know. Well, so maybe the big takeaway is I'm utterly devoid of any sort of inner life whatsoever. As a philosopher of emotions,
just playing.
Arid, dry, just vacuous blackness inside.
I'm just playing.
This has been really illuminating. Yeah, thanks, Myisha. Sorry, the connection's getting really, really terrible all of a sudden. I got to sign off. No, I admit, I don't feel as enthusiastic as I am about some of the possibilities of this tech. And I do find them useful in certain contexts with its research, assimilating a lot of information. I sometimes find AI useful as a conversation partner and thinking through ideas, brainstorming, that sort of thing. Usually at the start of a project, I find them increasingly less useful as the project develops. I want to make sure that's my voice, my ideas. And so I seek their input much less when a project develops. But I don't feel enough of an emotional pull towards them, but many people do. And I guess I think the fact that we're having increasingly, just as a culture and a society, increasingly perhaps skeptical conversations about big tech. The fact that even my 80-year-old mother, who is not all that tech savvy, knows about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and big tech and the dangers of meta and AI. And every time I go home to visit, she's constantly asking me about these issues. I think that's positive in the sense that it really suggests we are hopefully at a point where there's an increased kind of cultural sensitivity to this tech and thinking critically about, what are we being forced to do with this tech? Why are we being forced to pretend that this is inevitable, that this revolution is something that is just going to happen whether we want it to or not, and that we're all going to have AI friends in the next year or two, AI partners? I think just the fact we're talking about this as a society and that people are thinking skeptically about this is a positive development. And I guess my recommendation would be to continue that conversation, but then carry it over into how we interact with this technology, to be, informed, to kind of maybe our default stance should be a kind of epistemic kind of skepticism, where if the bot is not going to provide friction, it's going to be the seamless agent that wants to integrate with us and just, tell us we're awesome and great as a way of being really sticky and continue the conversation. We might have to introduce a bit of friction into the interaction ourselves and just pause for a minute and ask more critical questions about the bot. Maybe, again, just think more carefully about why is this bot asking me what it's asking at this moment? What sort of values is it articulating to me that, maybe aren't exactly aligned with my own, but that reflect the values of the designers and the companies that are behind the bot? They're basically becoming more informed critical users, I think is what I would say. And I realize that's a big ask. A lot of people don't have time to sit and have conversations like this and read the literature that you and I read. But I think trying to elevate the level of just cultural awareness about this technology to the extent that we think critically about, what is its role in our lives? How much access do we want to give it? How much reliance do we want to develop on it? And then perhaps most importantly, what are the values behind it? who's doing the designing, who's infusing the tech with certain values, and are these values our values?
We talked about fictionalism. The last time I was in Europe, no, I was in North Carolina. It was the first time that we bonded over the fact that we are
Yes.
both gamers. What video games are you currently playing, Joel?
Oh, man.
This is a very selfish question because I need to know for myself.
Well, I'll send you a longer list offline. So I have gone back to my Switch after.
Okay. Have you gotten a new one? Have you gotten a new one or no?
I have the Switch too. I had it ready to pick up on launch day. I
Such
admit.
a Nintendo guy. I am too,
am.
but go ahead.
I remember that, but I also I do have an Xbox as well, and so I dumped I don't know how many hundreds of hours into Baldur's Gate 3. I finished the latest Indiana Jones game, which I wasn't aware that I needed more Indiana Jones in my life, but turns out it was a great game, and I enjoyed it immensely. I finally finished Tears of the Kingdom, the last Zelda game. It looked great on the Switch too, especially on my big TV in docked mode. And I've lately been obsessed with a game called Dynasty Warriors, which is
And is this also on the
Origins.
Switch or Xbox?
This is on the Switch as well.
Okay.
It's a very high energy, it's kind of action RPG where there's a specific name for this genre that I'm forgetting at the moment. But you just basically run through different environments. It's set in China, I think in the 13th century. And I don't know, there's some semblance of a story. I'm just there to run through just hordes of literally hundreds of enemies with my various weapons, and you swing and you attack them as they're attacking you, and just endless waves of bodies go up in the air as you progress through this very kind of thin storyline, just moving through hordes of enemies, doing intense damage in a super, heroic way.
So
That's my relaxation at night.
No,
after
this sounds
a long day of
amazing.
thinking philosophically, I go home and kill hundreds of digital enemies on my Switch 2 at night.
And that was going to be my follow-up question. A lot of people think that as professors, all we do is profess.
Right. Well, we do a lot of that, to be fair.
Or read about what we're going to profess.
Right.
But my students are surprised to know that I have like a normal life.
I was shocked to hear that
And
you
I
were a
do-
gamer when you confessed that.
I know.
I was unexpecting that.
So I want to know how. A lot of people may ask, well, how do you make time for all of this stuff? So how do you make time for gaming, and why is gaming a part of your life?
That's a good question. I've tried to be more disciplined in the time that I make for gaming or other leisure activities. I sometimes do things in my leisure time other than gaming, although that's a big focus. I've been trying to be more intentional and compartmentalize in terms of making a work life in the office, when I'm at home, distinction, which doesn't mean that I don't do work at home or read and think and continue engaging in philosophy. But I've tried to be better as an academic, not necessarily as a philosopher in an abstract sense or existential sense, but as an academic, partitioning my work life from my home life. I think that's really important. And I think certainly as academics, but other professions struggle with this as well, to maintain that boundary. So basically, when I have the time, when I don't have other commitments, I come home at night, and I love movies, I love TV, I still read a lot of poetry and literature. And I try and make sure I get home in time where I can watch a movie if I want to watch a movie. I can read the book that I've wanted to read for a while. Or, more often than not, I pour myself a little bourbon and partition a couple of hours to play my Switch 2. Just being intentional about carving out space for activities that I think are nourishing and essential in a way. I love philosophy. I love my job as a philosophy professor. I love the teaching. I still get excited reading philosophical texts, but I need other forms of nourishment. And I think gaming is one of those, I have to admit.
But speaking of nourishment, we mentioned music in relationship to comfort. So I want to know, what is your go-to track when you're feeling down? Not when you're feeling lonely, because Joel doesn't feel lonely. But when you're feeling down or you need affirmation, what is your go-to track?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I don't know if I have a good kind of hype track that way. I don't know what I'm disclosing about myself and my inner life, or lack thereof, by saying all these things. When I listen to music, I generally tend to listen to music to downregulate my emotions. So I'm not someone that puts on some sort of frenetic Euro trash, to get kind of hyped up before a lecture, or, go meet friends or something like that. I tend to like kind of mellow ambient music, really atmospheric and slightly melancholy. But if you see on your camera, there's the red image. It's a framed record in the back.
Yes.
That is an album from my all-time favorite band, Cocteau Twins. They were a really influential, fantastic kind of post-punk band that started in Scotland. Their early couple of albums were a bit kind of spiky and abrasive, and then they gradually developed into this really rich, guitar-forward soundscape sort of sound, at the center of which was the lead singer, Elizabeth Fraser. She is one of the most unique and distinctive voices, I think, in the history of rock. She continues to exert a massive influence. People still talk about how influential her style was. The Cocteau Twins developed this intense cult following. They broke up in 96, but I still love them. And so I think actually the first track off of that album, Cherry Colored Funk by Cocteau Twins, is probably my go-to track for most emotions, whether it's hype, whether it's I want to sink into a warm melancholy, somewhere in between. That's the one I tend to go to.
Wonderful. Joel, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Myisha. Again, it was really a delight and honor to be here, and I was really happy to talk about these things with you.